This next live plenary panel is presented by Laudes Foundation and will address CFS Plus topical headline head-on, Redesigning Value. They will argue that it's not only just the small tweaks that are needed, but a fundamental shift in our industry to create a new system.
Welcome all, I'm Marina Colerato, and this panel is called Redesigning Value and the Fashion Industry. So this session will be recorded and will be available on YouTube if you want to watch it later. Well, rebalance power, collaboration, building resilience, system change, limits to growth, rewriting the rules, disrupting the mindset. That's some of the key ideas of this panel, and we will hear from advocates that have experience on the ground and can suggest how we can start talking about people and the environment, taking people and the environment into account. And we will talk with companies and funders that have begun their journey in making this shift a reality. We have here Leslie Johnston, CEO of the Laudes Foundation, Bala Murugan, Program Advisor of the Freedom Fund, Sandrine Dixson-Declève, Co-President of Club of Rome, and Jocelyn Wilkinson, Responsibility Program Director at Burberry. Thank you all for being here today, joining us in this conversation. Well, quickly, I want to share with you all some important data. Recently, the Oxfam International and the Stockholm Environment Institute have released a new reporting stating that the wealthiest 1% of the population were responsible for emitting more than twice as much as carbon dioxide as the poor half of the world between 1990 and 2015. The richest 10% of the global population, comprising about 600 million people, were responsible for about 52% of global emissions over the 20 years period the study have showed. And while global emissions are significantly concentrated in some classes, countries, and industrial sectors, it is the people, countries, and classes that least contribute to climate disruption who have the least resources to deal with its consequences and are most susceptible to the effects of climate change. People of the global south, women, and non-white people. As the recent Global Fashion Agenda and McKinsey report Fashion on Climate highlights, fashion is an important contributor to climate disruption, and if the industry does not take responsibility, the Paris Accord will be just a distant utopia. But offset carbon emissions, and Naomi Klein, an activist that is consistently explaining, will not work. We need real change, and we need to recognize the injustice and exploitation in the roots of our economic system, and that it's our current business models and mindset that are leading us not just to climate disruption, but total social and environmental collapse with staggering rates of inequality. So this is not particularly new for Club of Rome, an organization that has been questioning the limits of growth and accumulation fetish since the 70s. Sandrine, COVID-19 is just a small taste of the kind of social and environmental disruption we can expect if we all go back to business as usual, even if we go back to a better version of business as usual, right? Why must we act now?
Take myself off mute. Thank you so much, Marina, first of all, for this invitation, because we all know how important the fashion industry is to shifting our economic system and in particular our consumption patterns. I think that I want to first of all, read you a very important quote. The first is that we have to remember that this thinking around changing of the system and the fact that we're over-consuming has been around since 1972, so almost 50 years, right? And the limits to growth clearly indicated that this supreme effort is a challenge for our generation 50 years ago. It cannot be passed on to the next. The effort must be resolutely undertaken without delay, and a significant shift and redirection must be achieved during this decade. So if we think that that was said in 1972, and now we're 50 years later, and we are actually saying the same thing. All of us who are working in the area of the planetary emergency and the climate emergency, and have heard Greta and Johan Rockström and the Stockholm Institute say very clearly, we have a decade of action. And yet, we already know that we have all the solutions, but we don't have the expansive political will or business will to do what we needed to. So my call in particular to the fashion industry is that we have to both look at reducing consumption as well as shifting our materials, and look at circularity and regenerative economies at the same time. Now, we are part of the COP26 and the COP15 conversations around biodiversity and climate change. And we have been saying very clearly that we now have economies that have put in place new indicators to growth that are shifting away from GDP growth, and that are looking at how they cost externalities into their system. As we're faced with the convergence of tipping points between COVID, a health pandemic, climate, and biodiversity, those companies and those economies that have actually looked at the risk of stranded assets and that have actually integrated thinking around being more resilient by protecting the environment, by reducing their greenhouse gas emissions and investing in the future, are actually coming out much stronger. So I'll talk a little bit more around the new economic thinking, but I really want to urge the industry in particular, because you have such an impact, both in terms of your relationship with consumers, but also the way in which you use natural resources in every single part of your business to really create that shift. And I made a call last year at the Fashion Summit. I said, I don't want to be making the same calls this year. I have not seen the transformative shift of the sector that is necessary, both in dematerialization and the reduction of consumption, as well as substitution of materials, moving through also circularity and regenerative economies. So I am hopeful that we will really see that shift as we move forward, because we have to build resilient economies to these convergence of tipping points. And to be frank, people are not going to need a lot more clothes if they're actually sitting on Zoom calls because they're confined with the convergence of these tipping points and the pandemic that we have before us. So let's be clear. Materials are not necessary. Access to healthcare, access to food, access to water, and ensuring people's lives and livelihoods are what's most important at this time. So I hope that the sector will step up to the plate and be part of this transformative change that we need, and building that resilience that we need.
Thank you so much, Sandrine. Very important points you made. Let me just remember the audience that if you have questions, you can post them on the chat, and we'll be going back to that after our speakers' quotes. So let's go to Leslie. Sandrine mentioned that she was here last year, saying that she doesn't want to do the same demand for the fashion industry, but here we are, and to act now, it sounds like we need to start valuing the essential things that keep us alive, our business running, air, water, biodiversity, and of course people. But global capitalism is built upon excess, consumption, and inequality with a very short-term vision. Can we talk about redesigning the fashion system without challenging capitalism itself?
That sounds like a loaded question, but the short answer is no, we cannot. And I do want to repeat what Sandrine said, that is indeed the tragedy of the current volume-driven, cost-driven fast fashion system, which has become crystal clear during COVID. But of course, it's been very clear over the past couple decades. And while this global neoliberal capitalist system has done much good and as we know in fashion, has often created the first jobs for many female garment workers around the world, it is failing to create dignified and safe working conditions, and it's failing to protect or even regenerate nature. Why? Well, it all comes down to what we value. And under this neoliberal capitalist system, which has pervaded how we think, how we act, how we measure what's important, value has become equal to market price. So, for example, GDP has often been seen as the main indicator of economic progress, but as we all are aware, it falls short in measuring well-being. Its measurement of progress is not based on market price, and it leaves out things that we actually value. It's not necessarily these material things, but it's the care economy, it's the quality of environment, it's the equitable distribution of income. It's an imperfect measurement. And in our view, capitalism has tremendous power, and we've seen it unleash vast creativity. And of course, one of the most creative industries we know, the fashion industry, has benefited from that. But the system's flawed because we're not valuing what's important. We're not treating garment workers with dignity and respect. We're not respecting the natural resources on which the industry depends. We're not putting a price on environmental degradation. Fashion alone counts for at least 4% of greenhouse gas emissions, but that will rise if we don't do anything. It uses 43 million tons of chemicals per year. That's over 8,000 chemicals on a single piece of clothing. So what we'd like to see is a different kind of capitalism, one that harnesses the power of the market, that has incentives and protections in place to be able to, at the same time, value all people and respect nature. And at Loudest Foundation, we believe this is possible, and this is going to sound a little bit Pollyannish, but only if all actors, business, government, civil society, play their role. And we need to step up. Government needs to step up to ensure better social protections for workers. This was tragically evident during COVID in countries like Bangladesh, where millions of garment workers did not receive their wages when brands pulled back on orders. And of course, we need to put a price on environmental degradation. The externalities in this industry, such as the high use of water and cotton, the polluting of rivers, need to be costed and incorporated into the price of the t-shirt. And in my view, that would allow capitalism to do its magic, but also make sure that the true cost of a product is incorporated in the final market price. And if we have such radical transparency, then it will also enable each of us as citizens and users of fashion to become more informed and to make informed decisions when we visit our favorite shops.
Thank you, Leslie. Well, Bala, your work with Freedom Fund is exactly about promoting justice and equality within the fashion supply chain. Well, as Sandrine mentioned earlier, companies will need resilient supply chains from now on, but they will not come with buyers chasing the cheapest country to produce their goods. That is the basic modus operandi of the neoliberal agenda. So how has this way of functioning affected the producing communities through the supply chain, and what needs to change to guarantee dignity and basic human rights?
Thank you, Mana. Greetings to all. Tamil Nadu, where I live and work, is known as the textile hub of India. It's the largest producer of cotton yarn in India and a center for government production for export. There are more than 2,000 spinning mills located in the state and that produce yarn to transform into cloth that is used in the manufacture of garments exported around the world. But in spite of several efforts taken, there are persistent problems with the working conditions in this textile supply chain. There are significant right violations taking place in the spinning mills, where the majority of the workforce are women and adolescent girls. If you see, more than 80% constitute women and adolescent girls. In some cases, these conditions amount to forced labor, abusive practices that have been documented by international and local civil society include excessive and involuntary overtime, extremely low wages, sexual, verbal, and physical harassment, working conditions that inflict chronic illness and frequent injuries, lack of freedom of movement and association, and denial of statutory benefits like Provident Fund and employer state insurance. So brand sourcing and purchasing practices can exacerbate rights violations. If suppliers are expected to manufacture at increasingly lower costs in order to compete for business, it is the workers that suffer the most. Basically, they'll become the victim. This is true even beyond direct suppliers to brands, where the impact of unfair purchasing practices can negatively affect the working conditions further down the supply chain. At least up to tier 1, there is some kind of monitoring, but beyond tier 1, it's the condition is very worse. Although it's important to raise awareness of the conditions that young women face in the mills, we don't want brands to cut and run from this supply chain. So they need to have a sustained purchasing practices. In Tamil Nadu, the textile industry provides vital employment. It's a very big employment source, providing employment approximately to 300,000 workers. And the impact already, they have also explained, left the industry and workers in a very precarious condition. There should be an action to rebuild supply chains more ethically. So that we need to consider where value is not just placed in generating profits, but also in supporting workers' rights. So equally, it should be, there should be a balance between the profit and the respecting the workers' rights. Companies should invest in supporting the development of a stronger, more rights respecting industry in the countries that they are sourcing from. For example, textile industry in Tamil Nadu. Rather than moving to whatever the cost of production is cheapest, brands should look to invest in suppliers in key regions and develop long-term sourcing relationships there. So it might solve the issues to some extent. Thank you.
Thank you, Bala. Well, Jocelyn, when we talk about brands and companies that and what they can do for sustainability, and exactly what, especially what Bala said about not moving beyond one cheapest supplier to another, there's a white elephant in the room. That is the model of excessive production itself, dependent on excessive consumption. That is exactly what Sandrine mentioned in her speech. But it's not uncommon to hear that the luxury segment is the most prepared to change this model. Do you agree with that? What is the main challenges Burberry has accepted in this regard, and how can luxury inspire change in other segments too?
Thanks, Marina. You're right. It's a global challenge, and it's not just a challenge for this industry, it's a challenge across industries. We do have a slight advantage in that, of course, we encourage our customers to love their products and love them for as long as possible. We make products to an amazing quality, and we offer a really, really extensive repair and aftercare service. In fact, we deal with about 20,000 repair queries every year, and sometimes those products are decades old, and we're very happy to repair them. So there is a benefit that we have, but of course we need to look to the future, exactly as Sandrine was saying. We take a long-term view, as we believe every brand should, acting in this space. And actually we're working on 2040 scenario modelling to understand what the world will look like then, how we need to adapt, and how we need to change to make sure that we and our supply chains and those communities that rely on those supply chains can continue to be resilient. But what I think is really, really important is there isn't just action for tomorrow and looking towards tomorrow. We have to act now. All brands have to act today. And there are lots and lots of things that brands can do. So activating some of those levers for change, whether they're really big or really small, is critical, and is something that we are really, really dedicated to and have been for over 12 years. So thinking about small things, making shopping bags out of coffee cups that have been used, for example, is a small example, right through to maintaining really strong values during the COVID crisis in relation to our supply chain partners with whom we have long-term relationships. At the longest, we have 120-year relationships with some of our supply chain partners. And it's really, the relationship we have with them is really, really important. Through to managing implementation of environmental, social and governance criteria into our remuneration, and also harnessing sustainable finance, to one of the points that Sandrine made. We were really proud to release information about our sustainable bond a couple of weeks ago to the tune of £300 million. That's bringing our investors on this sustainable journey with us, and something that we see as critical to actually bringing the sort of sustainability efforts of the company to the center of decision making and linking with our investors. So I think it's about sort of a constant evolution and making sure that sustainability is increasingly put to the center of our brand and of the decision making within the brand at every level, small levels and big levels.
Well, before we go to the next part of our panel, I want to remind the audience that everybody can leave questions on the chat so we can reply for the questions later on. Well, Sandrine, we heard some specific challenges now. Everybody put some challenges and some solutions on the table. But in your experience, what initiatives have you seen that can serve as inspiration for fashion, and over how long should this change happen? Because exactly that's exactly the point you made about Club of Rome releasing the manifesto 52 years ago, and we don't have much time. So can you share with us some inspired examples, and how long can we take to make the changes?
Well, so I'm going to be very clear. We are in an emergency situation. That's why we published a planetary emergency. And we do have some real calls to action. And together we're trying to make that happen. We probably will surpass our 1.5 degree goal already by 2030. I mean, this is new data that's coming out. So it's really sobering. But then by the same token, I've participated in a variety of different conferences through the textiles industry and other materials. We are seeing decarbonization of high energy materials like cement industry that's actually going to net zero right now, as well as aluminium. And we're also seeing brand new fibers and new recycling and reuse techniques. We're seeing a lot of companies that are doing exactly what Burberry is doing in trying to really generate a circular economy. But we haven't brought it to scale. And that for me is key. And I think that the other key point, exactly as Leslie continued to build on the well-being economy, is that we need to fully change our indicators within our economy. We need to work with people to make them understand that actually owning more and the current ownership models that we have are not the right ones. Now, that will be that actually companies will probably have to take a hit. But I think that if we properly cost the real cost of materials and also labor, then we can really start to enhance people's lives and livelihoods. And that's what we need to talk about. So what are we seeing specifically in terms of economic shifts? We now have 5 global economies in different countries: Scotland, Iceland, New Zealand, Finland, Wales. We're bringing in Costa Rica, potentially Canada, who are implementing well-being economics. These economies are actually embedding society and nature into their indicators. So when we talk about capitalism, we're talking about natural capital, human capital, and resources being the essence of what we call compassionate capitalism, which is very much what Paul Pullman also talks about. So we're totally shifting the bar. We are looking at indicators which are bringing in actually a 3-pillar approach. So economic indicators that look at jobs, employment, distribution of wealth, with societal indicators, which brings in health and social care, education, community well-being and culture, with environmental indications. And those are the 3 key pillars that make up a well-being economy. And let me just bring one last unbelievable example. At the local level, at the community level, we are seeing a variety of different capitals. Just now, Brussels, before that, Amsterdam, picking up on donut economics. Donut economics were created by Kate Raworth, a member of the Club of Rome, who clearly demonstrated how you can actually put in place an economic model within the constraints of the planetary boundaries. and put nature and people at the core of your model and still be able to develop economically, but not using GDP growth as your only measure of how development happens. So this is incredibly positive and demonstrates the way in which we can move forward. And as I said, we have investment statistics which are clearly indicating from the investment community that coming out of COVID, it is those companies that have environmental, social, and governance principles, ESG principles, embedded into their business models that are coming out more resilient post-COVID. So they are already de-risking their value chains. That is a positive feedback loop on the way in which we should move forward.
Jocelyn, we know that change don't happen overnight, and Sandrine bring to us some examples of what can be done, and also you too when you talk about the Burberry actions. But it's been a while since we've been talking about incremental change and small steps to a bigger transition. How can the industry change with incremental steps, but without being condescending and committing to specific goals? Because something that is always lacking is objective goals. I will reduce this much of CO emissions. I will upgrade this much of salary in supply chain or something like that. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Of course, thank you. Well, as I mentioned before, I think it's really about kind of having one foot in the future and one foot in the present, and trying to use all of that knowledge to manipulate how we can actually have a strategy that fully drives some of the changes in behaviour that we know we need to see within the industry. So if I'm looking at today, really using our voice, so for example, through brand moments like the show, and bringing to life some of the sustainability messaging through the biggest event that we do in the year. And so we talked about our carbon regeneration fund through our show communications most recently. And we're really proud to do things like that, because actually that's what's driving trend. That's what's getting the interest of the consumer and of the great many people who are influenced by the trends within the fashion industry. So using our voice is something that's very, very powerful. And then really kind of being the change that we want to see in a visible way is critical. So, I mean, you might not know this, but our stores are powered by 90% renewable energy. We have a goal of 100%, obviously, and we're running ahead of time in terms of meeting that goal. And rightly so, it's taken a lot of effort to get there. There were countries where it wasn't available at the time we started that strategy. And I think embarking on things where you don't know what the answer is the right thing to do in order to drive sustainable business progress. Looking at sort of the core of our business and thinking about our products, you mentioned sort of having tangible goals. We have a goal of having 100% of our products with more than one positive attribute by 2022. The work that we do internally and with our supply chain partners to deliver those positive attributes is audited on an annual basis by external auditors, and we publish that information. At the moment, we're tracking to 89% of products driving positive change. And that means lots of different things, because positive change has to mean lots of different things, whether they're social or environmental. So, for example, that might mean that a leather bag comes from certified tanneries. It might mean that a factory has significant energy saving activities going on. We're using sustainable cotton, we're using recycled materials, or we're driving well-being and living wages within a facility. All of those things are key component parts of what sustainable apparel really looks like. And I think driving it through your product and very clearly reporting on those KPIs is critical, and something that we find, you know, a great challenge, of course, because we have partners to bring along with us. But if it's properly integrated into the core of your business, it's doable. And I think, you know, we would urge every one of our collaborators within the industry, whether they be brands or whether they be suppliers of ours, to join us in that fight to make all products more sustainable and driving sustainable change. And then lastly, I think this is something, you know, obviously Leslie's organisation does incredibly well, and that's harnessing the power of philanthropy. there's something incredibly positive there, where we can, in some cases, take risks, but also identify needs within communities on which this industry relies. In order to meet those needs, we can deploy some of our philanthropic efforts. And so we have a fully separate Burberry Foundation, and we carry out efforts all over the world in surprising ways, I think you'll find. So we have a significant program in Afghanistan, for example, where there's a lot of cashmere sourcing. You know, there are a lot of livelihoods in that country that absolutely desperately need to rely on legitimate trade. And so we need to build that legitimate trade, because that will support that geography in a way that perhaps other efforts may not be able to support them. And we do that always in partnership. So in that case with Oxfam. Or the program that we have in New York and Yorkshire in the UK, looking at young people and how we can inspire them about careers in the creative industries, and how we can give them touch points with our volunteers, for example, or with going to theatres and going to ballets, and actually now having more virtual interactions with some of those cultural activities, so that they have a different perspective on life, and they can see more than they might be able to see through their family networks, for example, especially during this really challenging time. We need to challenge ourselves to deploy all of the sort of strategic thinking that we do as a company, to really think about how that can support some of the philanthropic efforts of the Burberry Foundation. And over the last 3 years, we've been able to positively influence the lives of 200,000 people through those 3 programs that I just mentioned. And I think it's really, really important that we accept we don't have all the answers, but sometimes delving into the problems and the needs can teach us an awful lot. And I think that, you know, one of the main things we've been learning, whether it's through renewable energy or the foundation programs I just mentioned, is that collaboration is really, really king here. If we can collaborate effectively with the right organizations in the right places, we can bring about change. And that's really, really important to demonstrate, bring home to your kind of internal audience and your staff, because they're desperate to know that kind of information, but also to take, where appropriate, to your external audience and help them build a picture of what it really looks like to act responsibly within the apparel industry.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Well, Bala, there's something that I was thinking about, that you've probably seen and experienced many comings and goings when it comes to industry commitments to our suppliers. Well, which programs have been most successful and could be replicated as a way of ensuring justice and dignity for those who make our clothes?
As civil society, we have been working on improving the conditions for workers in textile mills in Tamil Nadu for many years. We are working or engaging constantly with local and state government and industrial bodies and associations to support the implementation of labor protections, laws and legislations related to workers' protection. However, we believe improving the situation for workers in textile mills requires a supply chain solution. So it cannot be handled in one region and one particular block or in Tamil Nadu, because globally it has been a problem. So we need a supply chain solution. Apart from a few brands that they have engaged in the region, international business are almost been absent. Even where they exist, initiatives have been limited in scope and have tended to adopt the top-down approach that rarely provides space for local civil society to participate. So we need to admit that there has been a limited movement by the global fashion industry to take action. We believe that there is untapped power in the influence of the global apparel industry to collectively try and improve the conditions in the textile supply chain. By joining forces with the local civil society, industry can chart a common route to ensure that textile workers are able to uphold their basic rights and dignity. This is why the Tamil Nadu Alliance, where I am also one of the founding members, which has created Tamil Nadu Declaration. The declaration is a call to action that we have developed as a grassroots civil society network, outlining the steps that we believe are needed by the fashion industry to address exploitative conditions in the textile and spinning mills. Though the declaration we are asking, through the declaration we are asking international brands and retailers to take action across 5 major goals, which will lead to address the severe exploitation that may be occurring in the textile supply chain. So it includes expanding the supply chain transparency to all the manufacturing facilities. That's the first goal that we are asking. So they can fix the time frame and they can work on it. The second thing, support the effective implementation of labor laws and protection in Tamil Nadu. It's not only in Tamil Nadu, as a whole of India, because there are several legislation that have been diluted in India in the form of amalgamation of labor codes. So that we need to work together with the brands. Then adopt sustainable sourcing and purchasing models that promote decent working conditions throughout the supply chain. This is very, very important. Even in the last time I mentioned it. So sustainable sourcing is very, very important for the supply chain. Then integrate worker-driven approaches to monitor compliances with the labor standards. That the labor standards could be monitored by the laborers rather than the external third party. Then the fifth one is the collective grievance mechanism. This is absolutely not available for the workers. So we need to, brands and civil societies, industries need to work together to develop a collective grievance mechanism so that the issues of the workers are addressed and they lead a dignified life. So importantly, we need to adopt a collaborative approach with the brands. We want to work with them to improve conditions for workers in the industry because our efforts, we realize that our efforts won't be effective in isolation. When we join with the other actors, definitely, we can make very good changes. This is true. This is true not just in Tamil Nadu, but even in other textile and apparel hubs around the world. So, this kind of collaborative approaches could be replicated to bring the changes and in the lives of the workers and improving the conditions inside the mill and ensure their dignity. Thank you.
Thank you, Bala. Well, before we go to the questions, I have one more for Leslie now. Well, Leslie, as a founder, how do you believe we can rewrite the rules and shift the power dynamics so the ones who are most vulnerable and also that are the majority of the world population can write their own future based upon justice, respect, and equality? And why collaborative platforms such as Fashion for Good are critical for accelerating such out-of-the-box thinking?
Great, thank you. Well, I think Jocelyn did a good job of pitching philanthropy, so thank you, Jocelyn. I don't need to go into how philanthropy plays a role. I mean, I do firmly believe there is a role for philanthropy because we can take risk, we can de-risk for others, we can try things that haven't been tried. For Loudest Foundation, we are relatively new kid on the block. We launched in January, and over the past 8 months, we've been consulting with about 250 stakeholders to understand exactly what role should we play. Because at the end of the day, philanthropic funding is minuscule compared to the power of business and finance and government funding that fuels these economies. So for us, it actually boiled down to 3 systemic intervention points that we as a foundation are targeting, which are very much influenced, Sandrine, by Donella Meadows' thinking, who of course was part of the Limits to Growth. And the first place that we intervene as a foundation is around mindsets. Ultimately, we need to change the narrative. We need to change the way each of us views and thinks about this industry. And again, this sounds very Pollyanna, but I don't want to underestimate the power of language and narrative. How do we convince CEOs that business as usual is no longer acceptable? Because actually, we're in an existential crisis. And we fund things such as research around S-curves that help CEOs understand how long it's going to take for innovation to actually scale. If you want to be, sort of net zero carbon by 2050, you need to start yesterday. So as a foundation, we're focusing on research to try to help change those minds. The second leverage point that we tackle is power. We all know that the power dynamics in fashion are lopsided, and we have to address this. I think, Freedom Fund, which is one of our partners, has been addressing that very well. You just gave the example of how workers are monitoring as opposed to being monitored. So there's lots of examples of how garment workers can actually take more power. But as a funder, we need to do more around that. And we need to actually focus on how can we put people and nature first as opposed to profit. And of course, power dynamics come into that. And the third leverage point that we focus on is the rules, which is my favorite. I love rules because rules govern our global economic system, and changing them is key to change. And I think, as Sandrine said, we do have an opening now. Yes, we've been talking for many decades about the system and how it's broken, but we do also see an opening in the clouds where people are imagining the Great Reset and what that means. So if we take advantage of this opening, what does that mean for our role as a foundation? And this is where we're coming in to actually try to influence through our partners those carrots and sticks, which can actually govern corporate behavior. So for example, you may be aware that the mandatory human rights due diligence legislation is on the uptake. And that's a good thing, because if more and more national legislations adopt this, then it becomes imperative with teeth for companies to know what's going on in their supply chains. And we need that teeth because we know that voluntary efforts are not enough. The self-governing we've seen in the fashion industry won't get us to where we need to go. So what do we do about this? You mentioned Fashion for Good. And what I love about Fashion for Good is it's a collaborative platform for innovation, which is kind of crazy when you think about it, because in the fashion industry, innovation was always your competitive advantage. But what if you bring everyone around the table and actually collaborate around innovation and support innovations that can look at clothing as a service as opposed to clothing as a product? And to date, Fashion for Good has actually nurtured about 110 innovators thus far out of about 2,000. It's unlocked about 130 million euros in funding, and it has about 20 corporate partners. So it is a very powerful platform for us to think about how do we change business as usual. But it's important to know that we're not going to do that by ourselves. We need to partner and collaborate with others.
Well, we have some questions, but unfortunately we don't have much time for the questions, but I appreciate everybody that is sending questions to us. I will choose one or two that we can address here. And one it's very interesting, it's how business models that balance profit and environmental social responsibility will not wield as much short-term profit as current models. How can companies adhere to this kind of long-term vision? Especially because surveys say consumers aren't ready to pay more for the products. So I think maybe Sandrine or Jocelyn can take that one.
I'm happy to take part of it, but I think Jocelyn should take it from a producer perspective as well, obviously. The only thing that I would say is that, again, statistically, what we're starting to see is that there is a shift. You need to shift also your relationship with shareholders. If we look at what Paul Polman has done with Unilever and many other companies now that are looking at the way in which they can share some of the responsibility in a much longer term perspective than short term in terms of the turnaround. So I think that we are seeing that there's a real shift. And as I said as well, we're also seeing that those companies that are coming out more resilient because they've de-risked their value chain. I mean, look at where we are now. Don't think of the past. The past is the past. We are in a totally new world. And within this new world, if we don't de-risk the way in which we do business based on environmental and social externalities, I don't think any of us are going to survive. So I would say, don't go back to business as usual. And what we're seeing is there is a positive profit. The profit is different though. It's much more distributed, it's much more equitable, and it's going to make us much more resilient in the long term. So you may not get all the money at the top, and you may not get the money in certain hands. It might be more distributed, but at the end, it will make you much more resilient as a company in the long term.
Thanks, Sandrine. I'll take over and add a few points to that, if I may. I think there are sort of two critical things here. One is it's very clear. Every consumer study you look at, they want to know that their products are driving sustainable change. They may have different ideas on what that means, and in different geographies around the world, they may be more keen on one topic than another topic. But the summary is they're keen on it, and so I think we're speaking directly to consumers when we make this happen. And we had an amazing example of this back in April. As you might remember, the world was busy in April and there was a lot of noise, but we released what we called the Reburberry Edit, and it was a collection of items which were either made of organic or recycled materials, for example, and also made in the factories where we're driving some of the change I mentioned around renewables and energy saving and so on. And we had an amazing response rate. Consumers are very interested when you give them the information about the products. So I think that's sort of one side. The other side is, and I touched on it earlier, I think you have to drive the sustainable change through the way in which you make your money. And that means attaching targets to products. And when we developed this strategy back in 2017, we were very clear that it had to be attached to product. And it couldn't be 95% or 20% or whatever, because there's always confusion then. If you make it 100%, then you're all working to the same goal. Us in the responsibility team, our supply chain team, who are amazing partners of ours, our product development teams, our design teams, and most importantly, our supply chain partners. Everybody would understand if it had 100% attached to it, there was no question, it's happening. It's going to be difficult, but we'll all do it together. And I think that's what's really, really important. It doesn't necessarily answer the big question you've asked, but I think it goes some of the way to be able to answer that question.
Well, thank you, Jocelyn. You did a great wrap up because I don't have time to wrap up. So thank you, everyone, and keep up with us during Copenhagen Fashion Summit Plus.
Thank you, Marina.
Thank you.
Bye, Marina.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
And now to the last part of CFS Plus, the breakout sessions. If you've forgotten which one you want to attend, go back to the program and find your online session there. That's all for today. From me here at Copenhagen Concert Hall, I hope to see you all tomorrow. I'll be back, same time, same place. Stay safe until then and enjoy the breakout sessions.